Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, to our discussion on the EU's neighbourhood from transformation to stabilization. To be honest, at the moment, stabilization is what we all would wish for in the neighbourhood. Multiple crises in recent weeks have demonstrated the need for the EU, but also for the United States, to step up and to pay more attention to the situation at the Polish-Belarus border, the Russian troop buildup at the Ukrainian border, and the future prospect for Western Balkan countries. Is there still a chance for stabilization, or do we have to brace ourselves for new conflict in the neighborhood? And what can the EU and the US contribute to stabilization? I'm delighted that we have such a distinguished lineup today to discuss these questions. It is our great honor and pleasure that Her Excellency, Madam President of the Republic of Kosovo, is virtually with us from Canada and will deliver an opening statement to kick off our discussions. Madam President, thank you for the privilege of joining us today. Also, I'm more than delighted, thank you. Also, I'm more than delighted that the leader of the Belarus Opposition, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, will address our panel with a video message on the current situation in Belarus. Moreover, let me also welcome Stefano, Sannino, Secretary General of the European External Action Service, who was, among many other positions in his distinguished career, also Director General for Enlargement. And it is also a particular pleasure to welcome from Washington, D.C., Fiona Hill, whom you all know is not only a great expert and author of There's Nothing for You Here, but also as former Russia advisor in the US National Security Council. And here with me on stage, let me welcome very cordially Andreas, former Member of Parliament and Vice President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking forward to hearing President Osmani's perspective on stability in the region and Kosovo's future prospect to kick off our discussion at this panel. Madam President, thank you again, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to join you all today, dear organizers. It's a great delight to be back to the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum after participating for a couple of years in a row. As you all know, I was supposed to join you in person today. However, due to changing circumstances, because of my official visit to Canada, I'm only able to join you this time virtually. I do want to thank you dearly for your understanding. Thank all the guests for joining us, and I want to wish the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum many successful anniversaries ahead. While I don't like to add quotes to my speeches, this time I really want to start by quoting Hegel, who said that we learn from history that we do not learn from history. This statement sadly rings rather true when one thinks of the enlargement process of the European Union with the Western Balkans. More often than not, we get the impression that history lessons are not being drawn. And with this trend repeating itself, we risk to repeat history as well. It must be clear to all of us that the prospect of EU membership for countries of the Western Balkans is the best guarantor for stability and prosperity in the region, and the lack of it threatens to foster instability and regress instead. As said many times by now, the EU membership of our region should not be a matter of if, but certainly a matter of when. The more promising the journey ahead will be, the higher the chances for sustainable progress and enhanced regional cooperation in the Western Balkans. 30 years after the breakup of Yugoslavia, Kosovo in particular, but the region in general as well, have taken important steps towards strengthening regional peace, security, and stability. However, 30 years on, there are still many pending and unresolved issues which are hindering the integration of the region into the European family. In recent years, we are also witnessing a shift of geopolitical focus from the Euro-Atlantic region towards the Indo-Pacific region, and a vivid stagnation in the EU path of our region, leaving behind the fertile ground for rising authoritarianism and illiberal tendencies at the expense of democracy. Respectively, the Western Balkans has turned into a geostrategic and a geopolitical arena where non-democratic and non-Western actors constantly work towards undermining the region's Euro-Atlantic enlargement process. At this point, I invite everyone to see this beyond the mere EU Western Balkans lens, because these malign actors have higher ambitions, and that is to fight everything that has been built by the Western allies and stands as an embodiment of the Euro-Atlantic values. So long as the EU fails to recognize these trends, the greater will be the risk of a successful EU enlargement policy and the European project as well. So striving to understand whether EU's enlargement policy has moved from transformation to stabilization, we can most certainly say the reality no longer matches with either the former or the latter. From east to south, the European project is not only being challenged from within as a result of growing Euroscepticism across some member states, but also by the external parties who are directly threatening its overall success. And this ultimately is reflecting in a seriously damaged enlargement process, as well as the ever-rising threats to stability and democracy. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the midst of these developments, the Republic of Kosovo, the country that I represent, stands out as a beacon of hope. The almost 14-year-old republic is home to institutions which stand up for democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Our institutions have engaged in an uncompromising fight against crime and corruption. That Kosovo and Western Balkans belong in the European Union is an ambition we have lived with many years now, and a prospect that the EU itself has endorsed. Guided by this ambition, the majority of the countries in our region, I stress the majority, have engaged in conducting historic changes and democratic reforms. But as our countries continue to do its share of work, the European Union has to deliver on its end of the bargain. And in the case of the Republic of Kosovo, it has yet to deliver on its promise to grant our citizens the long overdue visa liberalization. The increased internal challenges within the Union and the lack of unity for a long time now have been hampering the EU partnership journey for the countries of the region as well as the EU membership journey. Take, for instance, the case of Albania and the Republic of North Macedonia. Meanwhile, our northern neighbor, Serbia, unfortunately gets recognized and publicly applauded by so-called rule of law reforms, which are inexistent, by some European diplomats and politicians. And it's also applauded as a source of stability and progress. Again, something that is absolutely not true. This is happening at a time when Belgrade institutions publicly embrace and promote the so-called Serbian World Project. It's happening at a time when all of us are witnessing undermined democracy in Serbia, Belgrade's destructive role in Bosnia and Herzegovina, its direct meddling in Montenegro, as well as the constant interference and destabilizing presence in Kosovo through illegals. And these are all undeniable facts. And Russia sees the Balkans as a vulnerable periphery of Europe, where Russia can build a foothold, recruit supporters, and ultimately maximize its leverage vis-à-vis the West. And to attain its objectives, Russia uses coercion, cooptation, and subversion. It is due time for the EU to stop pampering certain countries in the name of preserving stabilocracy, and more importantly, stop the active policy of appeasement towards autocratic regimes such as the one in Serbia. What's happening in our region is not a coincidence, and the EU must finally understand that. What's happening in the region is a prelude to history risking to repeating itself, and together we must counter that. As we face these challenges, there is power in partnership. Power in partnership and strengthening the Euro-Atlantic coordination in relation to the Balkans policy becomes an imperative. Kosovo knows too well that when Euro-Atlantic efforts align, history is made. Today, the Republic of Kosovo and our region need an even greater political, economic, diplomatic, and cultural commitment of our Euro-Atlantic allies, because their greater and active engagement would counteract the risk posed by malign forces and strengthen the stability from within. On this note, I want to put a special emphasis on the role of Germany, given that Germany's contribution was and continues to be undoubtedly irreplaceable and inalienable. As one of the strongest voices within the EU supporting the EU future of the Western Balkans, Germany indicated many times that this is not just a geopolitical necessity, but also a process of vital importance to the region and beyond. On this note, the Berlin process stands out as a powerful impetus to the European perspective of the Western Balkans. The Republic of Kosovo remains faithful to the project of the Berlin process, believes in this process, and aims to continue advancing regional cooperation in this spirit. There is no other alternative for us. It is only through such well-structured, inclusive, and clear-aimed initiatives that bring our region closer together and that lead our region to the European Union. I am confident that the new German government will continue to be a strong promoter of the Western Balkans EU membership, and Kosovo looks forward to working closely with the new institutions towards meeting this goal. And ultimately, it must be clear to all by now that the benefit of the region's EU membership also means getting a step closer to the completion of the European project as a whole. From diversified supply chains to greater security, to improved prospects for sustainable peace and stability, to enhanced human rights, the benefits of the EU membership for the Western Balkans will undoubtedly flow both ways. My people and my country believe in this project. We believe in European values and keep demonstrating that our commitment to these values is stronger by the day. So, ladies and gentlemen, the integration of the Western Balkans is not only a strategic vision, it's also a necessity. With the ever-increasing number of alternative projects and offers in the region, but also beyond, such as the Euro-Asian Union and the New Silk Road, the emergency to deliver by the EU is as high as ever. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for this powerful opening statement for our panel discussion. 3 points that particularly stood out that you mentioned: the risk of repeating history, which I think is a recurring theme for our discussion today, also in other areas. Then you mentioned the urgency for a membership perspective, and you also mentioned that it's an issue beyond EU-Western Balkan relations, but a geostrategic arena. Before we bring in the other panelists, allow me a short follow-up questions. You mentioned the risk of repeating history. At the same time, the EU-led Belgrade-Pristina talk seems to have stalled. Prime Minister Kurti reproached Belgrade of trying to attempt a Bosnianization of Kosovo, and despite attempts to resume the talks in Brussels, how realistic do you consider the prospect of an agreement between Serbia and Kosovo?
First of all, I do not see the process, or I do not see, in fact, the process stalled, as you pointed out. Obviously, it's a very difficult process, considering the past, considering the fact that Serbia still does not accept deal with the past, and they're insisting on ideas that will not only destabilize and defunctionalize Kosovo as a country, but also ideas that will make the rest of the Western Balkans, the region and beyond, less stable, less secure, and less peaceful. For that reason, Kosovo's positions are very clear. Obviously, the kind of ideas such as changing borders or creating another Republika Srpska in our region are absolutely unacceptable because they go against everything that we have worked together with our Western partners to achieve so far in Kosovo and in the rest of the region, which is to create a stable and peaceful environment where our people can prosper and have perspectives for development. Serbia's ideas to create another Bosnia, to create another Republika Srpska more specifically in the region, are very much lessons that they draw from their biggest supporter, Russia. So it's practically the Russian pattern where by creating frozen conflicts, they want to later on create a prelude to partition and annexation. For that reason, I think not just those of us in the region, but everyone in the European Union and beyond should understand that this is not just, some kids quarreling or Kosovo and Serbia not agreeing on a little thing. This is Russia trying to undo everything that Western democracies have achieved in our part of the world. Because by pushing forward through Serbia as a trampoline, ideas which destabilize our part of the world, they're actually attacking the values-based systems which are EU and NATO. Because for us, the European Union is not merely a cash machine. It's fundamentals first. It's about rule of law. It's about peace. It's about democracy and human rights. And of course, NATO as well. It's not simply a military organization. It's about the values that it represents. And of course, all of these are not in the interest of Russia. And it is unfortunate that our northern neighbor is being used by Russia to destabilize the region, which means destabilize the entire continent. So, of course, we're doing our best by actively engaging in the dialogue process between the Republic of Kosovo on one side and Serbia in the other side. But this dialogue obviously is between two parties on an equal footing, where we discuss the relations between two sovereign nations. And everything is centered on mutual recognition as the only solution that can lead to peace and stability in our region. Other solutions that are sponsored and supported by Serbia and its friends obviously have an entirely opposite aim and should definitely not be supported by our allies.
Thank you very much. Let me bring in at this point Secretary General Sannino on this issue, and also I would like to take a broader look at the situation in the Western Balkans with you, because there are also serious concerns about a crisis and even a potential disintegration of Bosnia, which would have significant repercussions also for Serbia and Kosovo. High Representative Christian Schmidt just recently underlined this. And also, Madam President underlined the urgency for a membership perspective, and also that the European Union does not fulfill both aims, neither transformation nor stabilization. What would be your take on this, and what leverage does the EU still have in the Western Balkans?
So thank you very much for inviting me to join this conversation, and have to say, as you rightly pointed out, a very strong and powerful statement by the President of the Republic of Kosovo, which in a way is challenging the European Union as a whole to stand up to the expectation that we have created and to the work that we have started. The enlargement process is extremely important, still I think extremely relevant, as it has been pointed out by the President. It's the European perspective that has generated a number of changes in the Western Balkans and has created a different environment that hopefully should have led to a full integration of the countries into the EU. And I can understand the sense of disillusionment and also in a way of frustration that the countries are now feeling for the complexity of this instrument and of complexity of this policy. I don't want to, how to say, do any kind of justification or blame game. I think that the political evolution in the European Union has brought us where we are. We need to take into account also the complexity of the and the difficulty of the period that the European Union is going through. We have started already a few years ago with the economic and financial crisis. We have gone through a very difficult migration crisis, which we're still, let's say, trying to face, and we have entered then the present health crisis, which is still heavily impacting our societies. So what I'm trying to say that the European Union itself has in a situation where we are still looking very carefully at the need to avoid say further destabilizing elements for the EU. And unfortunately, this is what I said, realities, this is having an impact also on the strength, on the speed, and on the essence of the enlargement process. I think that we need to look in perspective and to continue to be positive and constructive about the future, but to continue working for this perspective to be alive. The member states have very often reiterated their attachment to the enlargement process, to the perspective of for the countries of the Western Balkans to join the European Union, then we will need to keep on working in that direction. This is a two-way street. This is, let's say, on our side, we need to deliver, and I accept that we are not delivering on a number of issues. On the other side, the countries of the region have to deliver on their part of the pact when it comes to the transformation, when it comes to reforms, when it comes to the rule of law, or to the reform of the judiciary. It is true that the lack of a clear perspective is having an impact on the pace of these reforms, and that a clear European perspective, clear timeline could also help these reforms to take place. But once again, in this situation, we need to try to keep this perspective open, and we need to keep on working on both sides for this to happen. What we are trying to do alongside with difficult path of the enlargement process, we are trying also to develop policies that are generating more confidence and more participation of the countries of the region into the EU process. And that's why we are trying to enhance our political dialogue with the region. We are trying to strengthen our economic presence. The investment plan for the region is an important part of this effort. We are working in order to align our positions when it comes to the external action of the European Union. We are trying to continue the approximation in terms of internal market, in terms of rule of standards and norms. So I think that this is an important element, an important part of the story. We have tried in the last few months also to come up with a specific action plan of initiatives that can be taken in order, for example, to talk more to the youth, to take initiative in order to include more the young people into the processes of the European Union, how to support civil society.
Thank you. Yeah.
I understand that there is a intervention of other countries and other powers, and that's true. It's something that is worrying us. The President was speaking about Russia, also other big powers are present in the region. But that's, I would like to say, it's also a choice of the countries of the region. Where do we want to belong to? Which is the kind of allegiance that they want to have? And I think that it's important that they stay faithful, I would say, to the European process, stay faithful to the European dimension.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary General. I think that's a very good point. You first outlined the domestic context within the European Union, and you just mentioned Russia, which was also mentioned by President Osmani as an important factor in this geostrategic arena, and you warned against appeasement and malign forces. I think that's a great opportunity to bring in Fiona Hill to talk about the elephant in the room in some, if not all, of the crises we witness in the neighborhood. Two questions to you, Fiona Hill. The first one is about the question of agency. We have a lot of conflicts in the neighborhood at the moment. Is it all about Russia, or do we overestimate Russian capabilities? How much agency can we give Russia in these conflicts? And the second question to you would be, there were so many hopes that the Biden-Putin summit would contribute to stabilization, would sort of give the guardrails for a relationship, obviously first in the nuclear and the cyber sphere, as was discussed in Geneva. But there was an idea to sort of sideline Russia and to stabilize the relationship. Has this failed against the backdrop of what we see at the moment?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's been really fascinating and very important to listen to Dr. Osmani and Mr. Sannino's commentary. And I'd like to pick up on something that the President said. She pointed out that Russia uses many of the conflicts, especially in the Balkans, and I would like to just give that a slightly sharper point. In fact, what we see Russia doing is that Russia exploits all of the cleavages, the divisions, the history, the geopolitical contradictions that we see in the region. It's not that Russia is creating any of the conflicts, but it's certainly, as she pointed out, trying to use them in some way to exert influence. And this is where our agency comes in. Because if we are able to mount collective action, if we're able to basically resolve many of the issues that are facing us, and actually mount, as it were, a kind of collective defense against Russian influence, then we'll be in a much better position. The problem, however, as we've been hearing, is that every time there is, let's just say, a failure to make progress on our part, we are slow and the process gets slowed down, that Russia, which is a lot more nimble and a lot more capable of exerting influence, because it doesn't have the same checks and balances, it doesn't have the same processes, it doesn't have, obviously, the same focus on reforms, that the European Union does, for example, in many of the areas that are on the agenda for enlargement, then it's very easy for Russia to basically get the upper hand in all of these issues here. And I think that is really our challenge. All of the divisions that we have in all of the European countries, Mr. Sannino pointed out the problems that the EU is facing, and actually I was surprised that he missed out Brexit in the middle of the economy crisis, the migration crisis. I would put Brexit in there before the health crisis, because when you're trying to manage a divorce, it's extraordinarily difficult to bring in new members of the family at the same time. And I think that what we've seen since then, with the very unfortunate disputes between the United Kingdom and France, the United Kingdom and other European countries, the United Kingdom and the EU, the questions about the future of the Northern Ireland Agreement, for example, they greatly complicate the whole picture. And this is a fertile ground for the meddling and interference of others. This leads into the problem with the United States as well, and the ability, as you've kind of laid out, to be able to stabilise the relationship in some way. I mean, the Geneva summit was just that. It was a summit, a meeting. It wasn't really necessarily even, the beginning of a process. And what Russia sees right now, from the vantage point of Putin and the Kremlin, is incredible disarray in the transatlantic alliance and in the West. The United States itself ripped apart by domestic contradictions, populist politics, partisan infighting, the inability of President Biden really to be able to bring the country together behind major reforms in the form of infrastructure bill and some of the other bills they're trying to push through for domestic renewal after the economic crisis and as we try to get ourselves out of the pandemic. And similarly, we have a lot of rifts between the United States and European allies. The AUKUS, quite frankly, describe as a debacle over the decisions of submarine development with Australia, and then the rift with France that had to be patched up. the legacy of the previous administrations, very difficult, very tense relationships with Germany, for example, and all of the debates about Nord Stream 2 and many other trade and other economic and investment issues. And the big debates about how we should be posturing ourselves to deal with a Russian threat that isn't just conventional in terms of Russia's military buildup. In the nuclear space, there's novel nuclear weapons, hydrosonic, basically all kinds of new nuclear weaponry, space missiles, shooting down a satellite, and then all of the different things that we lump together under hybrid warfare, which of course are none other than the old subversive and coercive kinds of activities that Dr. Osmani was already touching upon. And so in that kind of environment, what we really need is a collective response. And as you've noted, Liana, President Biden and the United States government have been very fixated on the rise of China. I think that's a challenge to everyone, in fact. But we're also kind of seeing then a kind of linking together of a lot of these territorial disputes in that regard. We're very concerned about what China might do with Taiwan. We've seen a lot of Chinese aggression towards other neighbours, including India and all of its neighbours in the Southeast Asia, territorial disputes with Japan, Vietnam, many other countries in that region. And I think there's a great concern that if we do not address the conflicts within European security framework, that this will have a negative effect on these other issues that we're concerned about in the Indo-Pacific region. So I do think that there is an imperative to get ahead of an impending and potential crisis in the Western Balkans, as the President laid out. We need to find some way of resolving quickly any tensions that might blow up between Serbia and Kosovo. I think we've had a very emphatic and very well-reasoned case laid out for that by the President of Kosovo. She also referenced the Republika Srpska and what we may see in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And these are all intertwined, frankly, with what we're seeing in Ukraine, with the pressure that Russia is putting on Ukraine. Whether Ukraine, unlike the Western Balkans, is ever to be on the docket for enlargement with the European Union, I doubt that that is going to be the case anytime in certainly the foreseeable future. Ukraine is still part of the European security, political and economic space and historic and geographical space. And so we need to find some formula, and perhaps, the course of the Berlin Forum, you will have a chance to discuss this. We need to find some formula of pushing back on this. The whole of European security and the whole future of European prosperity is at great risk now, unless we can find a way of mounting a collective action, of overcoming all of the differences that we have right now and all acting together. The United States can't do anything alone. It can't stabilise the relationship with Russia alone, because Russia is very much focused on the European security arena at this particular juncture. And that has to be very much the responsibility of Europeans. It can't just be left to the United States. Same with Kosovo and Serbia. The US also tried to broker arrangements there, but unless the United States, Germany, the European Union, and other partners are all on the same page, this will not succeed.
Thank you very much, Fiona Hill, for these very insightful points and also for pointing out the context in which US foreign policy operates, especially at the moment, also the focus on China and the Indo-Pacific. Andreas, Nick, I would also be interested to hear your take on stability in the Western Balkans, but also on the Russia issue. We have seen since Duma elections in September, we have seen so far unprecedented pressure put on journalists, NGOs in Russia, and we have just recently seen the threat against Memorial. Against this backdrop, was it the right decision to give Russia back its voting rights in the Council of Europe?
Well, let me start with the Western Balkans, and I want to applaud President Osmani for her courageous stand and wish her well on her mission for her country. Let me take up one of the points you mentioned at the beginning. I think there's a saying, you may escape your history, but not your geography. And I think this is very true for Europe as a whole, looking both at the Western Balkans and at Belarus and Ukraine, which we will talk a bit later. From a German experience, overcoming your own history is difficult enough, but your geography will remain defining your fate, and you will have to find a right way in that. From a Council of Europe perspective, I think this institution has made a great contribution, not only in the 1950s, but also again after 1990 in paving the way towards human rights, rule of law, democratic institutions, also across Central and Eastern Europe. And it may be a coincidence or maybe not that the two countries we talk about today, Kosovo and Belarus, are the two major countries in Europe who are not yet full members of the Council of Europe for very different reasons. Nevertheless, Kosovo is very active in Strasbourg, so their representative gets a lot of attention. We are involved as a Council of Europe in the EULEX program with the European Union and on a number of other aspects. But I think that one advantage in the Council of Europe environment is that everyone else in the Western Balkans is a full member. It is not outsiders, it's insiders, and we can work together. And I hope the time will come for the Republic of Kosovo also to become a full member. And it is a critical element, I think, for the EU's strategic vision that at the testing case, if we cannot provide even for stability in our own neighborhood, our geopolitical ambitions are probably in a very difficult state. We had a very inspiring discussion 2 weeks ago with the EU Enlargement Commissioner, who's from Hungary, and representatives from all Western Balkan states in a committee meeting in Budapest. And the level of frustration with our friends in the Western Balkans is enormous. I think that was articulated also there. And let me bring in the case of Northern Macedonia, where I think we have and that's not the Commission or our colleagues in Brussels, but the EU as a whole, especially on the nation-state level, has failed miserably. I think this was a government in Northern Macedonia that was willing to spend a lot of its political capital also in domestically difficult decisions to make their European case. It was a great achievement with the Prespa Agreement, a great achievement, I think, also by our Greek friends who were making also very difficult decisions, but that we were not able, in the impression also of the citizens of Northern Macedonia, to pay back and reward this kind of effort. And it may be, as one German newspaper commented, maybe have been the last leader in the Western Balkans who was willing to spend political capital on EU approachment. I hope President of Kosovo will prove that one wrong, but it is something where we have to ask ourselves very critical questions of how we behave because of a Bulgarian veto, because of some of the ghosts from the past again in this region. But we have also, I think, not lived up to our potential in other areas. And there the geopolitical context comes in. When I look at vaccination effort in the Western Balkan countries, when I look at infrastructure investment, I think there's a lot of other things that we could do to strengthen the development there, where I think we should be more ambitious and more vigorous in our approach. And clearly, Russia is an important player in this area. It is indeed, and there I come back to my initial quote, you can't escape your geography. I think we will. I don't think that a strategy will be successful over the long term that tries to ignore the fact that Russia is where it is and where it will remain in terms of Europe's geography. It is a question how we deal with it. I think it was a controversial decision to bring Russia back into the Council of Europe. I think there were two key aspects to that. One is to maintain a level of dialogue. There's not that many forums anymore next to the OSCE where we even have the chance of have this dialogue and even bring out the controversies that are there. And the other was clearly that Russia is a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights and has, in this form, subordinated itself to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. And it is, I think, the fundamental test case for this relationship, whether Russia will live up to that commitment. And so far they don't. We see this in the Navalny case, in the Memorial case, in many other. But nevertheless, if you look at the fact that Mr. Navalny, for example, and his family were relying on the European Court of Human Rights for in many cases to bring their case. So it is a delicate balance to walk, but nevertheless, I think to take up the Körber slogan, it's better to talk with each other than about each other. And if we were to pursue a strategy where we don't talk to Russia anymore with all the disagreements and strong criticisms that we have, I'm not sure this will be a long-term sustainable strategy. It may one that make some people feel better in the short term, but not necessarily achieve results over the medium and long term.
Thank you, and thank you also for underlying our claim, so I don't have to do it. That's perfect. Let me get back to you, Madam President. You already mentioned the Berlin process and the importance of the role of Germany. If we now look at the new German government, which hopefully in a couple of weeks will be formed, what would you say, what would be the 3 items on the to-do list of a new traffic light coalition, as we call it here, when it comes to Kosovo and the Western Balkans, the top 3 priorities you would like to see?
Well, there are so many. It's going to be a little hard to put them into 3, but perhaps the very first one is very much related to what I spoke about earlier, which is the urgency of making concrete steps in the enlargement process towards the Western Balkans. We need to go beyond words. You know, it's been since 2003 that we hear, since the Thessaloniki summit, that we hear the European perspective. We need now to walk the talk. And obviously, I'm not one of those leaders that argues for shortcuts, neither for processes that need to happen without rule of law, democracy, and human rights. Quite the opposite. I think those who have delivered, those who have committed, those who have shown that European integration, and I would say in the case of Kosovo, Euro-Atlantic integration, is the only option for them, and they have never looked elsewhere. They do deserve to move forward. First and foremost, when it comes to Kosovo, that means visa liberalization. We're going to need help with those very few countries that are still having some doubts. I would say primarily for their own political domestic considerations, not anything related to Kosovo. And secondly, to move on once the SAA is implemented with concrete steps for applying for a candidate status, and obviously for Northern Macedonia and Albania to finally move on as the expectations were and as they have delivered. The second very much relates to supporting Kosovo's domestic reform process, which is very much, as you know, focused on rule of law on one hand and creating new jobs on the other. Germany is our #1 partner from the EU in terms of trade. We're aiming at increasing this cooperation, also because of our extraordinary and very large diaspora, who is now increasing investment from Germany to Kosovo. But I think now, because of the nearshoring that is happening, because of the developments post-pandemic, Kosovo really should be seen as that next excellent destination to invest. With the youngest population in Europe, where 70% is under 30, who are multilingual, tech-savvy, with the cheapest labor, in an excellent position geographically, I do believe that with Germany, we're going to be able, with a new government, we're going to be able to push forward much greater cooperation in the area of trade. And the third very much relates to political and diplomatic support that we need. Of course, for Kosovo's statehood to be strengthened so that the region can finally be at peace and stable, we need to increase the number of recognitions and memberships in international organizations. In that sense, the Council of Europe truly stands as a top priority. We hope that Germany will take on a leadership role in supporting Kosovo to become a member of this organization, but also others. Because ultimately, for me, joining an international organization is simply just not about sitting at the table, because the end beneficiaries are our citizens. So joining the Council of Europe means that our citizens finally will be able to also address the Strasbourg Court, the European Court of Human Rights, for potential human rights violations. It will help us increase standards in this area on rule of law and so many others. Joining Interpol means that finally we will be able to fight cross-border crime. We have been doing very well bilaterally. Just imagine how well we can do multilaterally once we become a part of that platform. The same with UNESCO and all of the other IOs. Truly, the end beneficiaries are the citizens, and we really count on German support in this regard, so that we can really move on as a country, have that deserved seat at the table and contribute, no matter how small we are, really give an impactful contribution to the international community.
Thank you very, very much, Madam President. That's a very long list for the next government, but I think it's good that we have put this on the table here. Before we continue the discussion, let us bring in another perspective from the EU's neighborhood, from the leader of the Belarus Opposition, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who has sent a video statement to address our audience, and let us have a look at what she has to say on the situation in Belarus and in the neighborhood.
Dear panelists, Berlin Foreign Policy Forum participants and organizers, it's a pleasure for me to address you today on behalf of Belarusians who have been struggling for democracy for 15 months in a row. Our movement has transformed from big, beautiful rallies into a powerful, underground, but still peaceful resistance. The acute humanitarian and political crisis in Belarus clearly show that the situation is far from stable. The dictator, aiming to stay in power by all means, feeling total impunity, continues to terrorize not only Belarusians, but also neighboring countries. We all witnessed the development of the border crisis orchestrated by the Belarusian regime. Thousands of people fooled and then hostaged by the regime became a weapon in a heartless game against the European Union. The regime aims to divide Europe. The thug in power doesn't care about human lives, but he knows Europeans do. And now he blames Poland and Lithuania for not tackling the crisis he created himself. He blames Europe for clashes at the border that he fuels himself. There is another goal behind it: return legitimacy. Dictator hopes that blackmail will force the West to start dialogue with him, and he partially achieved what he wanted. Chancellor Merkel, who has been running a humanitarian mission to save the lives of people, had a call with Lukashenko. Hopefully, this call will help to save people's lives. However, such calls shouldn't become something normal. And I trust that European leaders are not fooled by the regime's strategy of legitimizing itself through blackmail. We must see the pattern clearly. Yesterday, the regime hijacked a European flight. Today, it's orchestrating a border crisis. Tomorrow, it might be facilitating drug trafficking or reporting suspicious nuclear power plant accidents. And this pattern will not stop until we address the root of the problem: a struggling dictator clinging to the remains of his power. Moreover, if Europe gives in to the pressure, it will undermine its own security, as it will become clear that it takes a manufactured crisis on the border to force it to do what the regime wants. And while we focus so intently on the border, we mustn't lose sight of the suffering that Belarusians are going through. There are currently 869 officially recognized political prisoners. Next to 50,000 people have been repressed since August 2020, and hundreds of civil society and media organizations have been shut down. 9.5 million Belarusians are also taken hostage by a dictator. Actually, the dictator doesn't deny his crimes against Belarusians. Moreover, he's proud of them. I don't want to quote this, but it describes well who we are dealing with. In his latest interview to BBC, he has said, "We'll massacre all the scum that you, the West, have been financing." It mustn't be an illusion. He cannot be re-educated or appeased. The key to resolve the situation is through a combination of assistance and pressure. On the one hand, I urge Germany and the European Union to provide support for human rights organizations, Belarusian media and civil society, especially those initiatives operating on the ground. On the other hand, I ask Germany and the European Union to adopt a comprehensive sanction policy, as it has proven to be the most effective way to ensure accountability and impunity. Belarus is a litmus test for what European values mean in practice. It's also an unconventional case, and it requires unconventional solutions. I hope that today's distinguished panel will have an opportunity to discuss the ways out of the crisis and what the European Union could do to ensure stability in its neighbourhood and in particular in Belarus. Thank you.
This was certainly another very urgent and impressive message from the leader of the Belarus opposition, which also reflects concerns of other Eastern European member states, just to quote Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki, who argued that Europe is in danger through an artificial migration crisis, high gas prices, and an attempt by Minsk and Moscow to destabilize Europe, which is, together with the situation in Ukraine, he called it synchronized crises. Secretary General Sannino, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya pointed out that the migration crisis can only be solved if we address the root of the problem, the situation in Belarus. What kind of leverage has the EU to impact change in Belarus, and what instruments do we have at hand beyond sanctions policy and the next sanctions package? What else can we do to change the situation in Belarus?
Well, first of all, let me say that I wouldn't define the crisis at the border with Belarus as a migration crisis, because it's much more, as the leader of the opposition was saying, a hybrid attack to the European Union. This is not, let's say, a normal migratory route. This has been created artificially. So we are speaking about something different, which is, let's say, extremely challenging for us, because we need to be able to respond to this. We cannot be seen as accepting this kind of pressure coming from Belarus or from other countries. It is true that at the same time we need to do it in a way which is also sensitive to the problems of the migrants, of the persons who have been instrumentalized, and that's why we are developing this humanitarian dimension that has also been mentioned, and where we are trying to create different conditions to move these migrants from the border, to allow them to go into a protected shelter, to receive humanitarian assistance, and to return to their countries of origin. Then there is a broader problem about what to do with countries that are, let's say, confronting our systems also of values, and that's what also what has been said. On one hand, certainly the sanction element is very important, it's very relevant. We need to say clearly that we are not going to accept this, so that we're not going to accept other forms of pressure. At the same time, we need also to keep on supporting civil society, those who are still fighting within the country or outside the country, and providing the third element, a perspective for Belarus in this case, and for the Belarusian citizens, with a package of possible support that we can give in the future. And we need to do this in agreement and in consultation with our partners. Fiona was speaking before about the importance that it work very closely with the United States. I think it's certainly a very valid point. All this crisis at the border of the European Union are certainly for the European Union, but we cannot not see what is also behind this, and which is the end of this chain. And if we have to speak about, let's say, how we confront more strategically Moscow or Beijing tomorrow, that's something that we need to do together, and it's not a chance that with the United States we have developed both a dialogue on China and on Russia, and we are closely cooperating with them in order to have a united and unified approach, which does not mean only confrontation. Let's be clear, it's not only just confront. we need to confront the challenges that we have, but then we need to be able also to run faster and to provide, let's say, a better perspectives for our societies and for the societies of all these countries.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. And Madam Tsikhanouskaya also mentioned Merkel's phone call with Lukashenko, which she criticized as this should not become the rule. And there has also been a phone call between the Chancellor and between Madam Tsikhanouskaya. So let me give a quick question to you, Andreas, Nick. Is there still room for mediation in this kind of way that Merkel has done it? She has been strongly criticized for this call without becoming instrumentalized and playing into the hands of Minsk and Moscow in such a situation?
I think again the borderline was pretty clearly drawn. I think the utmost was done that this call was not to be interpreted as a legitimization of the Lukashenko regime. It was pretty clear she talked to Mr. Lukashenko, not to the president of Belarus, whom we do not recognize in this capacity. But again, I think if you want to solve problems, if you want to provide solutions for urging matters on the ground, I think it is not a realistic approach to take an ideological position and saying which may make you feel good or look good for the short term in your domestic audience, but to contribute to solving problems on hand. And I think we have been somewhat more prudent, I think, in terms of our approach to Belarus. Again, the Council of Europe was also, it's not a member state, it was pretty early. I met Ms. Tsikhanouskaya in the Council of Europe context long before she came to Berlin for the first time. It is something where we have made so clear that it is about human rights, it's about the rule of law, it's about democracy in the country. It is not part of a geopolitical struggle. That, I think, is an important element that I think that we should keep stressing in the best interest of the people of Belarus. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think we cannot ignore the fact that there is an implication with a big, powerful neighbor in the east, and not talking to Russia, not talking to Putin, not trying to find a way, at least step by step, on solving individual problems is also not helping for a solution. But the worrying consequence or observation that we've made, that unlike Ukraine, where I think it was much more portrayed as a geopolitical struggle, it didn't actually help so far in Belarus that we didn't do it, which I think has pinpointed that the key challenge is that Russia continues to be concerned about democracy, about economic well-being in the former Soviet space because of the impact it would have on the domestic power situation in Russia. And I think that's something that Fiona is working on a lot, because their major concern is not necessarily Western powers getting to their border, but of creating precedents in Belarus, in Ukraine and elsewhere, where Russians at one day, if that works for them, why doesn't it work for us as well? And I think that is a broader context that we have to keep in mind, but that we cannot ignore also in dealing with the problems that we have on hand today.
Thank you. And before bringing in Fiona Hill on this, as you mentioned, urgent problems on the ground, let me give a comment and question opportunity to an audience member here with us. I'm pleased that Alexei Makeyev, the Special Envoy for Sanction at the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, is here on site in Berlin. And I'm looking forward for your comment and perspective from Ukraine on the current situation.
We have heard today two important words, crisis and challenges. And there is something very diplomatic in those two words. It's very impersonal, you know, a crisis, a challenge. But let me be undiplomatic and correct it in a different way. What we are facing right now is a use of weapon fired at us. We are under attack. With the real weapons, and this is what Ukraine is facing since 2014, we now see migrants used as weapon. We see energy supply used as weapon too. We see disinformation used as weapon against our community and our democracy. So we are all diplomats and civilians here, mostly civilians. What would be a diplomatic response to the threat and to such an attack? Would it be wise to put a diplomat before the foreign army which is rolling into Ukraine with invasion? I don't think so. But what could be the diplomatic answer be? First of all, is preventive diplomacy. And I think the US administration has started talking with the Russian regime on the recent escalation, and German Chancellor also started talking with Belarusian regime on stopping this escalation. The second answer is start arming Ukraine and helping us, because the only one ally which is on a daily basis fighting with Russia and the soldiers on the European soil which are dying every day and every week are Ukrainian soldiers. Third, get ready, compile a sanctions package and announce it. It would be too late to think about sanctions if and when Russia goes ahead. So it's time to do it and to announce it right now. Fourth, consolidate, because all the actions of the Russians and Belarusians are aimed at driving a wedge between allies. A weaker response from Euro-Atlantic community is exactly what Putin wants to achieve. And the last thing, and I completely agree with what Fiona said and many participants today highlighted, it's time to start with a real integration of Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and the Western Balkans into the European and Euro-Atlantic community. Treat those countries as something personal. These are your best allies, and this would be the best answers to those challenges, threats, and direct attacks we are under it. Thank you
very much, Alexei, and let me give this whole package back to you, Fiona, and even add another question, namely Nord Stream 2, which is obviously something we have to talk about in this context as we are in Berlin. To what extent has Nord Stream 2, and now it has been suspended for technical reasons, the certification of Nord Stream 2, how does this fit into the mix of the situation we see right now?
Well, thank you so much, Liana. And I think, as Alexei said, energy and Nord Stream 2 fit in very clearly, along with migrants, information, and many other issues that can be weaponized in different ways. And first of all, look, we have to look at what Russia's perspective is here. Unfortunately for all of us, Russia is still thinking very much in 20th century terms about Europe. I was just actually reading, before we started the session today, some comments by Dmitry Trenin, who I think many of us know very well from Carnegie Moscow Center, who runs that. Comments that he was making in a broader forum about the Kremlin and the Russian perspective on what's happening currently in Ukraine and in Europe in the neighbourhood. Russia clearly sees that there is no independent action on the behalf of either Ukraine or, Kosovo, Serbia, Western Balkans, or in fact any other major European actor, and still sees this in terms of a struggle for Europe with the United States. Let me just point out very bluntly that World War II ended 76 years ago, and this December will be the 30th anniversary of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which really marked, I think, definitively the end of the Cold War. So we're talking about decades since there was a struggle for Europe in any kind of format between the United States and Russia in a Cold War sense. And yet Russia continues to think that way. And I think every European sitting here should contemplate that. Russia does not see Europe as having any agency. It does not see European security institutions as really counting for anything. And Europe is continued, in Russia's view, to be an aircraft carrier, which is how it's described Ukraine, or Putin has described Ukraine, kind of pointed at Russia, and that any activity by the United States or any activity for Europe to mount a coherent security approach is somehow being directed against Russia. Of course, we all know we're living in the 21st century, and we have a whole host of other existential crises. not least, kind of what we do about China and how we manage that relationship to try to put that on a different footing. I don't think anybody in the United States or anywhere else wants to see a repetition of history in terms of conflicts with China as the next rising power, and we've had plenty of those over several centuries. We have to deal with climate change and the exigencies of this. This is an existential threat for all of us. And I think this is where energy comes in, because the Russians are seeing the writing on the wall after COP26 in Glasgow and realise that there will be a very assertive move away from hydrocarbons in the next several years, and that gas and Nord Stream 2 are only here for a shorter duration now. I personally think it was an enormous mistake of Germany to conclude Nord Stream 2, just as it was a mistake for Nord Stream 1, just as it was a mistake as the United States has believed for decades to have any of the large energy pipelines from the Soviet Union to Europe. We've always said all along consistently that this would be open to blackmail. I think Mr. Lukashenko leapt right into that. Of course, that wasn't his position to say, but said, well, if you kind of turn back the migrants, you don't release me from all of these sanctions, then I'll turn off the gas. We knew, of course, that he couldn't, because that would have to be done by Gazprom and by Russia, and he'd get reined in. But he made crystal clear the manipulation of energy through those pipelines that we already saw targeted against Ukraine back in 2006. So the sad fact of the matter is that we are dealing with a 21st century set of problems. We have pandemics. We have the question about how we're going to organise ourselves to rebuild our own societies after all of these difficulties of economic crisis and COVID. And Russia, very sadly, is still stuck in the 20th century and thinking about how it can partition and divide Europe. What Russia is asking for, frankly, with all of this pressure, is to sit down with a new Yalta. They actually have control of Yalta right now through an illegal annexation, and want to sort of sit down with the United States over the head of all of the Europeans to work out what might be a new Congress of Vienna type arrangement, going back into history and the dangers of repeating history, as the president of Kosovo pointed out, or some other basically arrangement at everyone's expense, including Ukraine. And this gets to my point again. This is a moment, this is a wake-up call for Europe. We can all push back together. Of course, we're not pushing back because we want to invade Russia or kind of put Russia on the back foot. We want to have a discussion with Russia. This is what everybody's been talking about in the United States. We want to find a way of creating strategic stability and predictability in the relationship. But our great difficulty now is that Russia sees Europe in a different context. So it's up to you in Europe, in Berlin and elsewhere, to show Russia that you want a different set of relationships, and that European security is very important and Europe's neighbourhood is important, and that this is not the prelude for a new division of Europe in the 21st century. That's the challenge that we have. And yes, we do have a crisis, and as Alexei Makayev said, everything will be weaponized because everything can be exploited. So, I mean, this really is, I think, on Europeans to stand up. And if strategic autonomy is a thing for Europe, then we'd better start seeing some real action. And I know it's difficult in Germany right now with the new coalition, but I think that's going to have to be top of the agenda, taking European security seriously and giving Europe agency as well, and not perpetuating this myth in Moscow that somehow Europe is just an object in an old-style struggle between the United States and Russia.
Fiona, thank you, Fiona, for outlining this clash between the centuries in essence, and also the need for Europeans to take their own security seriously. We have a couple of questions coming in from our audience. You can contribute via our conference platform or with the hashtag Berlin Forum. And I'm glad to see that the first question comes from Ambassador Ederer, the EU ambassador in Moscow. He comments and he asks that the two key weaknesses of the European Union in devising successful policies towards its neighbors are a lack of unity on anything from Western Balkans, Eastern Partnership to Russia itself, and second, a total lack of anticipation of Russian interests, capabilities, nuisance potential. Any proposals from the panel on how to address these two weaknesses? And I would like to give this question first to Madam President and then to Secretary General Sannino. Madam President, you can.
Well, perhaps it would be members of the European Union that would be best suited to answer this question. How do they address the lack of unity, one, and how do they address the lack of anticipation of what are the real intentions of Russia? Perhaps on the second one a little bit, I think we should always start by mentioning the fact that lessons learned should not be forgotten. It is important to look back at Russian history and understand that, you know, the oligarchs there might have changed, but their intentions have not, especially intentions towards Europe as a whole, Europe as a continent on one side, geographically speaking, and secondly, the European Union as a values-based system have not changed. Given that these intentions have not changed, I think anticipation should be higher as to what to expect. It's simply important to go back to history, understand that with autocrats, appeasement never works. Quite the opposite. It simply encourages them to further use all of the areas that were earlier mentioned as weapons against parts of Europe, and also to understand, as Fiona rightly pointed out, the fact that this is much bigger than the small picture that some may see, you know, a conflict between some Western Balkan countries or simply internal issues in Belarus. These are not internal issues. These are not conflicts between some tiny countries in the Western Balkans. We need to look at the big picture. European Union members need to look at the big picture. This is Russian autocracy versus Western democracies. This is what it is. And when you see it that way, obviously the anticipation then is at a much higher level. You know what to expect. And I think once you have this anticipation at a much higher level, then it's easier to achieve the unity that we all need. Because you understand all of these as geopolitical and geostrategic issues rather than domestic problems of individual countries. And of course, then hopefully it would be a little easier for European Union leaders to go beyond their domestic political considerations and understand how this affects us all collectively and not just citizens of some individual smaller countries.
Thank you, Madam President. Secretary General, probably the lack of unity in the EU is something you have to deal with every day. So you might want to answer the question on the lack of anticipation of Russian interests. And then I would also like to give one question to Andreas. We do not only have German elections and the formation of a German government, but also French elections in spring next year. Just a quick take from your side. Are you concerned about a vacuum in Europe during this period? But first, Secretary General.
We can talk a lot about the lack of unity of the European Union and the problem that we have. I mean, I think that somehow it's much better to understand that we are a union of 27 sovereign countries, sovereign states, and that none of our member states is ready to give up its sovereignty and its sovereign decisions. So once you have started with this, then we can start working to see how we can get positions together and how we can manage to get a sort of common area where we can agree on moving forward. The lack of anticipation, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's not that we are lacking an understanding of which are the Russian interests. I think that we have a different perception of this within the different member states of the European Union. And once again, I mean, it's much better that we recognize this. We recognize the fact that that is a complex structure and that we need to work with what we have, because otherwise we run the risk of feeding not only our common frustration, but also the sense that we are unable to decide and do things. And I think that is not the case. We are able to do things. We can make a certain number of decisions, but we need to understand that it's more complex and that we have to be able to be more inventive, if I may say so, in finding these solutions. So I think that as in every negotiations, knowing your strengths and your weaknesses is an important point. What I notice is that there are moments where, in spite of all these things that we are lacking, we are able to decide. Essentially, we are able to take decisions, and we have taken decisions when we have imposed sanctions, economic sanctions, following the invasion of Ukraine, or when we have, let's say, stood against a number of actions that were taken by Russia, saying this is it, and that's the limit that we are posing.
Thank you for pointing out these positive examples, Secretary General. Just because I want to hear a quick answer from Andreas Nick on the question of French elections next year. Are you concerned about the lack of leadership?
It is absolutely true that we are going through a very delicate moment with Chancellor Merkel leaving the stage, with French elections looming. Don't forget, anticipation has a lot to do with understanding, with assessing, with direct dialogue. The Chancellor was one of the last who was able to speak to President Putin in both their own languages, in Russian and German, so that is an important element that may be missing for the future. The French election is highly important. We had very close coordination also in terms of Russia policy in the Minsk process, in bringing Russia back into the Council of Europe, by the way. Clearly this creates an environment where someone may be tempted to test the resolve and the ability to act in Europe. What I'm most worried going forward is actually that there may be an increasing willingness in our foreign policy to rhetoric escalation, but a lack of willingness to invest in hard capabilities at the same time. And I would rather prefer the opposite, being vigilant, being resilient in terms of what is happening, and at the same time being able to talk and to better anticipate what's going on the other side. The other thing is potentially a very dangerous environment, and I hope we can avoid that.
Thank you so much. Our time is unfortunately up, but those participants who registered on our platform can continue to discuss with Fiona Hill about populism and threats to democracy in our deep dive, which starts right now. And here on the main stage, we will move immediately to our next panel. So join me in thanking our fantastic speakers today for being with us and for this tour d'horizon of the neighborhood. It was a great discussion, and looking forward to seeing you again.